I name this river the Avon River. I name this river the Dunlop River.
This shall be the McAllister River.
This shall be the Barney River.
And I name this Mount Wellington.
And I name this Mount Gisborne.
This is the story of the Australian Alps and Gippsland, and of 3 Europeans who claimed to be the first explorers of these regions. The first left records so vague that it's unsure what he discovered. The next 2 discovered the same rivers, the same mountains, and the same lush pastures, but each gave them different names. These 2 never met, but their paths certainly crossed, and so did the swords of their supporters. In 1839, Paul Edmund de Strzelecki sailed into Sydney. Colonial society loved a nobleman, even a Polish nobleman, and he appeared in Sydney as Count Strzelecki. The title was bogus, but Strzelecki's accomplishments were not. He had explored widely in many countries, and he quickly established a reputation in Australia as a geologist and explorer. Amongst the many influential friends he made in Sydney was James MacArthur of the famous Merino family.
Yes, sir.
On a sea voyage, MacArthur had recently sighted promising land above Wilson's Promontory.
Now, I'd like to show you this region down here that we spoke of. I think if
He was keen to explore the prospects of this country for grazing. Strzelecki was keen to explore the geology of the Great Dividing Range. They agreed to join forces in an expedition.
I will be delighted.
Excellent.
James MacArthur financed this expedition to the tune of £500. He was one type of Australian explorer, the type who did not want to publicise new country, at least not until he'd occupied it with his own stations.
Count Strzelecki! Yes, I will come. You go on, I will come.
Strzelecki was a quite different kind of explorer, the kind that became classical in Australia. He was not interested in acquiring land, but he was interested in acquiring fame, or to put it more kindly, in serving public rather than private benefit. He wanted to make important discoveries and to tell the world about them. The expedition began in March 1840 from Ellerslie Station in southern New South Wales and headed south through the Upper Murray Valley towards the western side of the Australian Alps. Strzelecki's eyes became fixed on these massive mountains. He was determined to conquer them.
The steepness of the numberless ridges, intersected by gullies and torrents, rendered this ascent a matter of no small difficulty, which was not a little increased by the weight of the instruments, which, for safety, I carried on my back.
The contents of Strzelecki's backpack showed he meant business as a scientist. They included a mountain barometer, chronometer, a sextant, a compass, a thermometer, and chemical apparatus, and weighed over 20 kilograms, or 45 pounds. Oddly enough, Strzelecki was not the first white explorer, and not even the first Polish scientist to travel the high mountain country. 6 years earlier, in 1834, a small expedition had headed south from Sydney towards Cooma, and the still uncharted country of the Snowy Mountains, or Australian Alps. The leader was Dr. John Lotski, an unusual character and one of the first Polish arrivals in Australia. He was a man of wide scientific interests who wandered the world collecting specimens for European museums. Tact was not one of Dr. Lotski's strong points. When he failed to get the post of colonial zoologist, he denounced New South Wales government officials as corrupt. As a result, when he decided to make his name by exploring the Alps, he had to do it without government money. Somehow he got together 4 convict servants to help him collect rocks and plants and insects, raised a loan for his horse and cart, and set off. Lotski travelled beyond Cooma to an outstation called Mutong, near Dalgety. Here he prepared for a journey into country unknown to white men. Lotski forced his way west towards what he took to be the head of the Snowy River. His actual track remains in dispute to this day, but at the end of it, he had to climb a very high mountain.
The 6th of March. I was on top of Mount William, the absolute altitude of which is, according to the preliminary calculations I was able to make, from 5,000 to 7,000 feet, and therefore by far the highest point ever reached by any traveler on the Australian continent.
No one is certain which mountain Lotski called Mount William IV. Some authorities say it was Drift Hill. Some say it was Kosciuszko. But Kosciuszko is above the tree line, and as a botanist, Lotski would have noted that. In any case, it seems that Lotski was the first white man to reach the edge of the Kosciuszko Plateau. And from his position, he could see the high plains to the south, which the natives called Omeo, and he called Stanley's Plains. He failed in his effort to reach these plains, but he found a way towards them. Within a year of his expedition, the first graziers had pushed through from the Snowy River to Omeo, and it may be that they owed a greater debt to Lotski and his track than they ever acknowledged. Dr. Lotski tried to publish his work by installments, but he ran out of cash and subscribers, and his journey from Sydney to the Australian Alps folded up before it got very far. He had hoped to make money from the extensive collection of stuffed birds and animals, insects, plants and mineral specimens he'd brought back, but nobody in Sydney would buy them. Lotski could get no credit of any kind, and he disappeared unrewarded from Australian history, calling himself a foreign dog, 5 years in these colonies. At the head of the Murray, opposite the Gehi walls, Strzelecki with MacArthur and 2 Aborigines started the steepest part of the climb. In their uncomfortable clothes, they struggled up the mountains until they were stopped by darkness and exhaustion. And they started again before dawn the next morning. By noon, they were near the top. Strzelecki and MacArthur sent the Aborigines back to form a base camp while they climbed on. By early afternoon, after a laborious climb, the 2 men stood on the peak of the high mountain that had faced them across the fearful depths of the Gehi Gorge. They had climbed Mount Townsend. They saw other peaks around them, and MacArthur wrote,
"The Count, by the aid of his instruments, quickly detected one of them as being considerably higher than where we stood. I could not but respect and feel deep sympathy with my friend when, with his hat off, he named the patriot of his country.
Kosciuszko.
The mountain Strzelecki saw was 3 kilometres south of Townsend and 20 metres higher. That afternoon, and quite alone, Strzelecki climbed it.
Once on the crest of the range, the remainder of the ascent to its highest pinnacle was accomplished with comparative ease. I found myself on an elevation of 6,510 feet above the level of the sea. A lucid sky above me, and below, an uninterrupted view of more than 7,000 square miles.
Although in a foreign country, on foreign ground, but amidst a free people who appreciate freedom, I cannot refrain from giving this the name Mount Kosciuszko.
Paul Strzelecki had conquered the highest mountain on the Australian continent, and he named it for the Polish patriot Kosciuszko. The name of this dead and far-distant patriot was not a household word in Australia, but this was one of the stirring moments of Australian history, and it was recorded on this memorial. The date on the plaque is wrong. Strzelecki himself published this wrong date, February the 15th, 1840. But MacArthur's diary proves it was March the 12th when Kosciuszko was climbed. Strzelecki came down off Kosciuszko after dark, and he fell many times and probably damaged his instruments. So he later calculated the height of the mountain wrongly. It's actually 7,316 feet, or 2,228 meters. So he got the date wrong, and he got the height wrong. There were later suggestions that he'd made a much more serious mistake and got the mountain wrong, that he had climbed Mount Townsend and named that Kosciuszko. But he made no mistake about that. This is the highest mountain in Australia, and it's the one that Strzelecki climbed and named Mount Kosciuszko. He didn't take much away from here, only a small rock and an everlasting flower to send to the woman he loved in Poland.
Here is a flower from Mount Kosciuszko, the highest peak of the continent, the first in the New World bearing a Polish name. I believe that you will be the first Polish woman to have a flower from that mountain. Let it remind you ever of freedom, patriotism, and love.
The expedition now turned south, towards the country that had first intrigued James MacArthur. At Omeo, they found that several graziers had established themselves during the past 5 years, driving cattle across from the Monero. To their surprise, they also found that one man had gone much further than Omeo. He was Angus Macmillan, a Scot like many of the early white settlers in the mountains, a tough Highlander from the Isle of Skye. Macmillan had established an outstation at a place called Ensay, but his mind wasn't entirely on the job. He kept thinking about an even more promising land of coastal lakes and plains, which he'd glimpsed from the high mountains. In January 1840, with a party of 3 other white men and 2 black guides, Macmillan pushed south for the coast, down the valley of this river, which he called the Tambo. It was tough going, but rewarded by the rich country at the end of the track. Macmillan called it the most delightful country he'd ever seen, well adapted for sheep or cultivation. He came to and named a succession of rivers and lakes. The Nicholson River, the Mitchell River, Lake Victoria, Lake Wellington, the Avon River. And the more he saw, the more he liked.
The river running majestically around the hill and the low country, extending as far as the eye could carry, put me in mind of the land of brown heath and shaggy wood, land of mountain and the flood, that I gave it the appropriate name of Caledonia Australis. It was then that I keenly felt that I had a noble and glorious task to perform, and that I was only an instrument in the hands of the Almighty to accomplish it. Here was a country capable of supporting all my starving countrymen, lying dormant.
Angus Macmillan returned to tell his boss, Lachlan McAllister, that he'd found such good land that McAllister, with all his friends and their cattle, could never fill it. McAllister had no intention of filling this new territory with his friends, any more than Macmillan meant to fill it with his starving countrymen. They were going to fill it with themselves, their stockmen's huts and their herds. And until they could do that, they decided on a policy of total secrecy about the discoveries. Unfortunately for them, young Matthew McAllister, Lachlan's nephew, was in charge at Ensay Station the day that Strzelecki's expedition arrived here from the north, 2 weeks after the conquest of Kosciuszko. Perhaps Matthew didn't know about the secrecy agreement, or perhaps he was transfixed by Strzelecki's hypnotic charm. But he spilled the beans, well and truly.
Yes, and what is general direction of this country?
You follow the river.
He told them all about the marvelous discoveries to the south, and he even guided them for a day along the established track down the Tambo River towards the coast.
Depending on how far you want to go, really.
The Strzelecki party followed Macmillan's track for over a week. But Strzelecki showed no consciousness that this country had ever been explored or named before he came.
On account of the cheery prospects for future settlement which this land holds out, and which it was my lot to discover, I took the liberty of naming this, in honor of His Excellency the Governor, Gippsland.
A very unhappy Macmillan later described Strzelecki as a foreign impostor.
I was not at home when the Count called at our station, but I have every reason to believe that he, or Mr. MacArthur, who accompanied him, were aware of my discoveries before they arrived at my place.
It's just as well that Macmillan and Strzelecki never met one another. No two men were so opposite in character. Strzelecki was an extrovert, anxious to share his exploits with the world. Macmillan was reserved and concealed his discoveries. Both were self-taught, but Strzelecki was a scientist of some distinction. Macmillan was a practical farmer and pathfinder. Strzelecki had a knowledge of scientific instruments. He knew how to survey and produce maps. Macmillan had a knowledge of bushcraft. His only aids were a cheap pocket compass and a torn chart of Matthew Flinders. Strzelecki not only renamed Macmillan's Caledonia Australis after Governor Gipps, but he renamed every river he came to. Macmillan's Tambo River became Strzelecki's Thompson. The Nicholson became the Riley. The Mitchell became the MacArthur. The Avon became the Dunlop. The McAllister became the Barney. And the Glengarry became the Latrobe. It's not clear whether Strzelecki knew Macmillan's names for all these places, but in due course the Surveyor-General, Sir Thomas Mitchell, another Scot, ordered all Macmillan's original names to be restored. All except two. Strzelecki's name Gippsland, for some reason, had a pleasing ring to the Governor of New South Wales, Sir George Gipps. And the name Latrobe for this river appealed for similar reasons to the future Governor of Victoria, Charles Joseph Latrobe. It was near the Latrobe River that the Strzelecki expedition made a drastic change of plan. They'd become entangled in thick scrub, and their supplies were running low. The original plan had been to head for the coast at Corner Inlet. Now Strzelecki decided to head for the nearest settled area at Westernport. The horses became exhausted in the boggy ground and had to be abandoned, along with Strzelecki's instruments, an event remembered by this cairn near Canella. At this point, the party had only 3 days' rations left of damper and bacon. Why didn't they kill the horses for food? Apparently because Strzelecki calculated they were only 40 kilometres from Westernport in a straight line, which was the way he preferred to travel. In fact, it was over 100 kilometres away, and Strzelecki's straight line led them straight into one of Victoria's most formidable ranges, a tangle of dense green undergrowth, vines and fallen trees, which was left unsettled for many years afterwards. It's called now the Strzelecki Range, and it took the Strzelecki party 14 days to hack and batter their way through it, the last 11 without rations. They were saved by the gun of the young Englishman, James Riley, and the bush skills of the Aboriginal Charlie Tarra, who was quick to spot the only game in the forest, koalas. The bush was too wet to burn, so the koalas had to be eaten uncooked. That citizen of the world, Paul Strzelecki, had stomached a few things, but never raw koala, pungent with eucalyptus. Aborigines weren't called explorers because they couldn't write English narratives or publish scientific maps. But they knew something more fundamental: how to survive. The white men swallowed their scruples and Charlie Tarra's raw koalas and survived just long enough to reach Melbourne. Melbourne was still an isolated settlement, still a part of New South Wales, only 5 years old with 4,000 people. And the arrival of the Strzelecki party caused an absolute sensation. The Port Phillip Herald reported,
"We have sincere gratification in announcing the arrival in Melbourne of Count Strzelecki, the enterprising pedestrian naturalist, and his friends, Messrs. MacArthur and Riley, from an exploratory tour through the Terra Incognita on the southeast coast of New South Wales, in the course of which they have made highly important discoveries and have undergone excessive privations."
The newspaper accounts gave detailed and glowing reports of the Gippsland area, and Strzelecki followed up quickly with a report to Governor Gipps.
"Scarcely any spot I know, either within or without the boundaries of New South Wales, can boast more advantages than Gippsland."
Strzelecki also published the first detailed map of the new country, and this information greatly assisted new settlers to move into Gippsland. Meanwhile, the Melbourne newspaper reached Angus Macmillan, who was furious to read reports describing Count Strzelecki as the discoverer of Gippsland. He was even more enraged to find that not only was there no reference to himself, but that all his rivers had been renamed.
I was the first person who discovered Gippsland, and when I started to explore that district, I had no guide but my pocket compass and a chart of Captain Flinders.
Macmillan complained to a Sydney newspaper, The Colonist. The editor was the Reverend John Dunmore Lang, another Scot, and he laid into Strzelecki with a vengeance.
We think it clear that the credit of this discovery does not belong to the Count, and that he must have known it did not when he claimed the merit of it from the public. It may correspond with Strzelecki's notions of honor to usurp or pirate another man's discovery, but it is anything but handsome in the estimation of a genuine Englishman.
This was pretty John Bullish stuff, considering it was one Scot defending another Scot and attacking a Pole. But it showed the turn the debate was taking. Strzelecki's argument was that discovery had to be a public act, not a secret one. Recognition and honour should go to the explorer who published a description of his new country and shared the benefit of his discovery with the general public. Macmillan may have done more exploring work in Gippsland, but it was Strzelecki's reports which sparked the public interest in settling here. Strzelecki moved to London and published his major work, Physical Description of New South Wales and Van Diemen's Land. The 5 years spent exploring Australia were later rewarded when Strzelecki was knighted by Queen Victoria. It was as much a triumph for diplomacy as exploration. That earlier Polish explorer, John Lotski, managed to offend the same powerful people that Strzelecki charmed, and Lotski was soon extinguished in colonial Australia. Macmillan did in time receive the credit as the explorer of Gippsland, and he settled down here at Bushy Park as a grazier. Both Strzelecki and Macmillan could at least argue that they'd found something worth fighting over. A quarter of a century after George Evans first crossed the Great Dividing Range, an explorer had climbed the Pinnacle of Fame, Australia's highest mountain, and had discovered in Gippsland 4 million hectares of lush grasslands, lakelands and rivers. The next explorer, far west of the ranges, had no such luck. He showed that no explorer could expect much reward if nobody wanted the country he discovered.